Confused Lefty asks, which decade in late 1800s or early 1900s is the most comparable to the 2020s in terms of class consciousness and organization building? You know, there have been several times where I've sat down and discussed this very question with with people who have a theoretical knowledge and some historical understanding. And after a lot of deliberation, we pretty much always settle in sometime in the middle to late 1800s. And I personally am thinking maybe more in the middle 1800s. You know, I've had people reach out to me after the conversation and point to some detail and be like, yeah, bro, sadly, I'm thinking it might be more like the early 1800s. And that's legit. That might be true. It's kind of hard to tell because there are a bunch of people writing very radical things that look like they could be those foundations we saw in the early 1800s, which led to the radicalism and militancy of the middle 1800s and later the revolutionary potential of the late 1800s. But it seems like the overall radical consciousness of the population is not nearly as high. What we have is a very small, ultra-radicalized portion of the population that is extremely militant and extremely active, but the majority of the population is really not active in any of these struggles. No bodies are being created which actually seem to meet the masses of people where they're at. Instead, what we have is radicals who are very separated from the movements of the masses. So now contrast this to, say, the middle 1800s. In the middle 1800s, there was a proliferation of things like unions and cooperatives, and even starting to be things like federations at significant scales. Nothing on not a global scale. We didn't have the first international until a little bit later, but even by that point, we were starting to engage the masses in the struggle itself, such that there was a lot of spontaneous action of the masses to create these revolutionary bodies. We don't really see that in the era we're in right now. Not to say that it's not beginning to happen, but I just want to note that it's mostly happening among radicals, right? So like most of the people who are watching this channel are radicals, people who already kind of have a radical ideology. A lot of them are organizers, as we've seen in the chat. So that makes us part of this kind of militant minority, which is brought up in a lot of theory. The thing is the militant minority in a lot of these countries has done very little to actually bring their message to the masses. They've done nothing to actually engage the masses in the activity that would lead them to spontaneous revolutionary activity. And so that I consider to be our failure. And it's part of our failure to do this that is allowing, for example, the right wing to spread fascism among lots of average people, is because we are not there inoculating them against reaction. Instead, we just want to host protests, and we just want to have radical little affinity groups that are split off from the rest of society and don't do any work actually integrating with normal people. So I think that that will be what shifts us through the middle 1800s to the late 1800s, will be our ability to actually move toward mass action that is not just protests. And that involves all kinds of things, but it has to be the active construction of power structures. It has to be things that are actually going to stick, not this sort of stigmergic, chaotic thing where we just like put things together and they fall apart, and they put things together and they fall apart. That shit is not going to work. It never has worked. It never will work. So I think what's going to transition us through those middle 1800s, the late 1800s stage, is going to have to be us rapidly prefiguring these power structures and figuring out ways to actually engage normal people in what we're doing. Instead of trying to constantly signal to other radicals how radical we are, we need to start thinking about how it is that we're actually going to engage the average person in struggle to emancipate themselves from a system of hierarchy.